Welcome back to another one of Mr. Lang's vlogs. Today we're talking about the leaders of the civil rights movement. So let's get right to it. Now, one of the essential questions we're going to be going over today is what were the goals and tactics of these different civil rights leaders in this movement? So we have to, again, go back to how life was prior to the civil rights movement. And back then, everything was segregated, unfortunately. Signs were everywhere saying only whites can drink here, only whites can eat here, only African Americans can eat here, and so on. And this unfortunately became a fact of life because of these Jim Crow laws that basically had segregation throughout the South, but also here in the North as well, to a degree. Now, African Americans and other minorities also had to use separate facilities that oftentimes were a lot worse than what the whites had to go ahead, had the opportunity to use. So all of this is really going back to what we talked about way before, and that is, well, Plessy v. Ferguson, where Homer Plessy sits in an all-white railway car and as 1/8 African American is arrested under Louisiana law. And when this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, it's ruled that separate but equal did not violate the 14th Amendment. Now, we know this is 100% not true, but for years, this is how America was run, where everything from schools to restaurants to every other facility was segregated. And this all comes to a head with Brown v. Board of Education. This was something that this Supreme Court case was supposed to fix this. You hoped. So in 1952, the NAACP was a group for the desegregation of African Americans led by Thurgood Marshall at this point, argued on Brown's behalf to desegregate schools. So Brown is going to win, and segregated schools are going to be illegal. So this was a fantastic and landmark Supreme Court case, as now it proved that separate did not mean equal. And oftentimes when we looked at an all-white and an all-black school, they were completely different. And where the all-white got more budget, more funding, had better textbooks, better desks, better facilities, and of course, the African American schools did not have that, unfortunately. So here we have African Americans earning the right to vote again. Now, African Americans could vote after the 15th Amendment. We learned that before. However, there were a lot of obstacles placed in their way that they couldn't vote. Things like literacy tests, things like poll taxes. And, well, we get here in the 1960s the 24th Amendment, which does away with the poll tax. Again, prior to these, poll taxes in some cases were needed to be paid, and really restricting African Americans from voting. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to eliminate literacy tests and require that it's federal examiners that register qualified voters, not state examiners, as of course these state tests, these state examiners, oftentimes would be incredibly racist. And it gave the Attorney General the right to file suits against the use of poll taxes and in any state's election. Because of course, states were still trying to get away with that. And so this helps protect African Americans and is a very landmark landmark law during the civil rights movement as well. Now, one of the most famous things we see during this era is Rosa Parks and her arrest. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus. Again, back then, African Americans had to sit into the back of the bus, whites would sit in the front of the bus. She was arrested, she was charged with the violation of a segregation law of Montgomery City Code. And, well, we have something that's landmark again. Again, 50 African-American leaders in the community are going to meet to discuss what to do about Rosa's arrest. Now, Rosa Parks wasn't a tired old lady like everyone thinks she was. She was actually working for the NAACP, and this was actually a very much coordinated act. And her famous quote from her autobiography is, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, though some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. So again, Rosa Parks was no stranger to this. She was an active member of the civil rights movement, joined the NAACP chapter in Montgomery, and of course, in 1944, Jackie Robinson refused to give up his seat in Texas, and that could have been inspiring to it. Probably even more would be the 1955, prior to this, just 2 years before. You have the black activists in Montgomery building a case around Claudette Colvin. Now, Claudette Colvin doesn't get a lot of attention, yet she really did the same thing that Rosa Parks did. In fact, she did it first. She was a 15-year-old girl who refused to give up her seat on a bus, and she was arrested and forcibly removed from the bus as well. But again, what it was really Rosa Parks was a little bit more organized. And so it's kind of interesting to think that Claudette's story is one that is similar to Rosa Parks and done first, but it's similar to how we remember Rosa Parks, where everyone thinks, oh, she was just didn't want to give up her seat, not really digging in that Rosa Parks really was doing it not only on purpose, but was a whole planned event. Now, African Americans are going to make up 75% of passengers in the bus system, but still had to deal with these unfair rules. And so, of course, this is where we get the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And on December 5th, 1955, through the rain, again, you have African Americans in Montgomery begin to boycott the buses. And, well, you have over 40,000 black commuters that are going to walk to work now, some as far as 20 miles. And many African Americans are going to carpool together as well instead of taking the bus. And there's so much cool footage to see them walking down the street together in big crowds instead of taking the bus, going right by that bus stop. And the boycott lasted over a year, 382 days. And the bus company's finances were struggling. So until the law that called for segregation on buses were finally lifted, they continued to boycott. And it does get lifted, thank goodness. But again, it's that perseverance that's incredible, and that civil disobedience that's incredible as well. And of course, this goes right into Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King really was an inspirational and incredible man. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, he's going to graduate Morehouse College with a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology. Later, he goes to BU, where he gets his PhD. And in 1953, at the age of 26, he becomes a pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And he starts his civil rights leader here in the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Again, instead of using violence against the bus companies to get what they wanted, they were going to do it through civil disobedience, a nonviolent way, essentially a nonviolent protest here, and resistance to support the civil rights movement. And it worked. Now, he does have his very famous March on Washington, where more than 20,000 black and white Americans celebrate in a joyous day of song, prayer, and speeches. And the march is going to be led by a group of very important clergymen, civil rights leaders, and politicians. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. will be there as well. And this is where he steals the show with his speech, "I Have a Dream," which is still to this day one of the most famous speeches in all of U.S. history. Again, this powerful speech, he states eloquently that he desired a world where blacks and whites could coexist equally. And he gives this speech right in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which is so symbolic, as of course it is Abraham Lincoln who frees the slaves. And so the speech used things like the Bible, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, all these as sources. And he used an incredible number of symbols in his poetic address that's going to captivate not only just the audience at Washington, but throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. His powerful words, such as, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Wow. Straight from the Declaration of Independence. "I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they're not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And of course, black men, white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. It is an incredible speech from beginning to end. And we're going to watch it right now.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. And every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. Not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
So later, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, during a peaceful protest. And very famously, he uses that to create the letter from a Birmingham jail, a very famous letter that was in response to one that was sent to him by 8 Alabama clergymen that was called a call for unity. Now, the men recognized these injustices that were occurring in Birmingham, but believed essentially that the battles for freedom should be fought in the courtroom, not in the streets. And so in the letter, very famously, King justified civil disobedience, what he's been doing, the nonviolent acts, the nonviolent protests, by saying that without forceful action, true civil rights would never be achieved. And direct action is justified in the face of unjust laws. And we all know these were incredibly unjust laws. Again, in the letter, he's going to justify his civil disobedience. And here's some of the quotes from it. I cannot sit idly in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There can be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the U.S. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself. And we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. And wait has almost always meant never. Those are very powerful quotes that were taken from that letter. Unfortunately, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be fatally shot at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, after giving a speech just the night before. And he's going to be assassinated by a man named James Earl Ray, who's a white fugitive from Missouri State Penitentiary. Now, again, if you put on your tinfoil hats, many believe that it has been a conspiracy, a larger government conspiracy theory that Ray was simply a scapegoat for, and that this assassination was much bigger than what it originally looked like at the outset of when it happened. Again, whether or not that's true, we still don't have any concrete evidence, but it has been very thoroughly investigated. So, unfortunately, we don't know. But we do know that Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy still lives on today, incredibly through his work, his speeches, his letters, everything. Again, we still see so much more segregation going on here in the 1950s. In 1957, Orville Favos, the governor of Arkansas, decided he wasn't going to integrate white schools like the Brown v. Board of Education said he needed to. So what he did was he sent in the state National Guard, literally state troops, to go ahead and prevent these 9 black students from attending a white high school. And in response, because that's absolutely crazy, he's going against federal ruling. So President Dwight D. Eisenhower sends in the Army, not just any division either, the 101st Airborne, to protect these children from the angry mob restricting them from going to school. Essentially, what ended up happening was these Little Rock Nine, these incredibly brave students who, literally braved these mobs, braved the state troops that eventually were put under the control of the Army, because again, federal government is in control over state governments there. And so, of course, what we see is, they went through all of this just to go to a white school to prove a point. That's incredible. That's perseverance. We also see something later in the 70s, and that's, that unfortunately it's not just the South that's, racism was huge. The Boston busing crisis. This is unbelievable to some, but 100% true. The Boston busing crisis in the 70s was a series of protests and riots that occurred in Boston, Massachusetts, like here, in response to the passing of the 1965 Racial Imbalance Act. Now, the Racial Imbalance Act, what that did was it was passed by the state, which showed that a lot of African Americans were going to schools, in schools that, although yes, the schools were desegregated, the busing was one of the biggest issues, as really the African Americans were all, concentrated in certain neighborhoods, and so these neighborhoods would go to these certain schools. And so this was a way for the state really to start, really just show integration needs to happen in these schools. So the court laid out a plan for, a bus of students from predominantly white areas of the city to schools with primarily black student populations and vice versa. And so the legislation provoked huge outrage by Bostonians that led to huge widespread protests and violent public disturbances, to the point where there's going to be things hucked, like thrown at these buses as they're going through the neighborhoods. The conflict is going to last over a decade and contributed to a whole demographic shift in Boston public schools, something that we've even seen still to this day, where dramatically fewer students enrolling in public schools, and we have more white families sending their children to private schools instead in the city. It's a very interesting thing that we've seen, and it's very interesting that, of course, here we are in Boston, a very, liberal state, is still going through this racism in the 1970s. It's kind of unbelievable, but very true. Again, to show you a little bit of tier 2, most northern cities presented this unique challenge to integration. It was not easy to desegregate schools that were determined by neighborhood. Boston's was determined by neighborhood, as you can see here. I found this map and I kind of outlined where everything is there. And so they would be bussed into different neighborhoods in order to, reintegrate the schools here. Okay, the riots, the protests were unbelievable. To see this is right down there in Faneuil Hall, Quincy Market. In addition, we have sit-ins going on during this era. Now, a sit-in is a non-violent resistant protest where African Americans would sit at a white-only counter to break the color barriers at diners and lunch counters. Woolworth's is definitely the most famous. It was a department store with a lunch counter, and well, one of the most famous sit-ins occurred there. As you can see, it's on the bottom right of your screen. Again, these sit-ins were civil disobedience, non-violent, and essentially going ahead and proving that there's no reason why African Americans can't just sit at that lunch counter as well. So we also have a lot of legislation that's passed throughout the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and definitely even Johnson years. So first we have the Relocation Act of 1956, which encouraged Native Americans to move off reservations and integrate into the cities. Civil Rights Act of 1957, where it made it a federal crime to prevent qualified people from voting based on color. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by new President Johnson after Kennedy's death. This act is going to ban discrimination in employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Again, we're progressively getting better at a slower rate, but we're progressively getting there at this point. We also have something called Freedom Riders. So the Freedom Riders, during one summer, really the 1 year, it was, they started around Christmas. These were white and African-American civil rights activists that are going to protest to end segregation on public transportation by going on freedom bus rides in the South. They were attacked, arrested, even bombed, very famously in Alabama. And after the bomb was thrown into their bus, they actually were, when they got out of the bus, they were actually beaten. But they continued on, which is incredible to see. And in the fall of 1961, the ICC finally desegregated bus terminals. That's what they wanted. They wanted desegregation again, the end of segregation on public transportation. And here they got it. They won. The Freedom Riders won. And it's pretty incredible. Now, during this time, we are also going to have another movement. We were here talking about nonviolent civil disobedience, but that is not the only movement going on during the civil rights movement. We have something that's going to be a little more militant. One thing that we see that comes up during this era is something called Black Power, and it's a term that emphasizes racial pride and desire for African Americans to achieve equality. The term promotes the creation of black political and social institutions. The term was popularized by Stokely Carmichael during the Civil Rights Movement, and it has continued on through today. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is going to become critical leaders of that articulated nonviolent responses to racism. And, what we start to see is this shows up in the public atmosphere as well. Tommy Smith and John Carlos are going to give the Black Power salute at the 1968 Summer Olympics, and they're going to be suspended by that, unfortunately, and banned from the Olympic Village. Now, this is considered a milestone, as again, it shows that, here we are in a nation that allows for free speech. That's our First Amendment right. And yet here we have two men who, again, won Olympic medals during the Summer Olympics, putting off, going ahead and giving the sign of Black Power, and yet they're punished for it. We also have the emergence of the Black Panther Party, which is a U.S. African-American militant group that wanted to end police brutality in Oakland. However, what's going to happen is they're going to obviously spread far and wide, but that's really where their roots were. It's going to be led by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. They believed in violent and nonviolent revolutions being the only way to receive their freedom that they deserve. They are going to be militant. They are going to encourage African Americans to arm themselves as well in defense. And also, pretty amazingly, they're going to actually get free breakfast programs put into schools, free health clinics, and Black history put into schools, which is pretty amazing. But they also are a militant group. So they're not going to be like Martin Luther King Jr. They're going to be different. They're going to be a little bit more violent. And these aren't all the Black Panthers, but these are some that, unfortunately, we start to see become a little bit, more militant. In the late 1960s, especially, the party leaders got involved in a lot of violent confrontations with police, and the results were death on both sides. Huey Newton was actually tried for killing a police officer, and the Black Panther activist Bobby Seale was a member of the Chicago Eight, which the Chicago Eight were 8 people who disrupted the 1968 Democratic Convention, very famously. In addition, we have the Dodgers. That's right, the baseball team. Pretty interesting stuff that the Dodgers noticed Jackie Robinson for his exceptional talent. Well, Jackie Robinson was an African American, and here we are in a segregated sport, unfortunately. And so in 1946, Branch Rickey is going to sign Jackie Robinson. And at the age of 27, he's going to become the first black baseball player in Major League history. Now, we look back at how inspiring that truly was. That there he is, your first black baseball player on the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was a strange choice, though. And the reason why was, he wasn't the most logical person to become the first African American ball player. He was not really a prospect. I mean, he was already 27 when he entered the league. That's already getting up there in the age in baseball. He had somewhat of a temper, and this does come out occasionally. Again, he believed that Robinson's outspoken mentality would benefit the cause in the long run, and I think they made the right choice because of that. However, Rickey did urge Robinson to maintain a level head in the first few years, that's for sure. Knowing the importance of his actions, Jackie Robinson did. We couldn't imagine, playing baseball and having racial slurs yelled at you from the stands. But Jackie endured that. And it's amazing to see that, what he did was he opened the door. It was so, again, another big landmark here in the civil rights movement. It's incredible to see. And so, because he faced so much racism, and I mean, not just slurs from the stands, members of his own team are going to refuse to play with him. Opposing pitchers tried to beam his head, again, while base runners tried to spike him. He received hate mail, death threats daily. Fans, like I said, are going to shout racist remarks at him in every ballpark he goes to. Hotels and restaurants are going to refuse to serve him. Again, he still carried on. He still went on, and he didn't let that affect him. That's pretty incredible. And so Jackie Robinson's actions are going to affect the world far beyond just MLB, Major League Baseball here. His courage and his discipline in standing up against racism were a preview of the actions taken by members of the civil rights movement. And really the success of Jackie Robinson's experiment, that they would call it, was a testament to the fact that integration could exist, that it should exist. In 1960, at the age of 6, Ruby Bridges became the first black elementary school child to attend an all-white school. And due to the white opposition of integration, Ruby needed to be escorted to school by federal marshals. And so here we have the very famous Norman Rockwell painting that says, "The problem we all live with." And there she is, little Ruby Bridges. And after Ruby entered the school, many of the teachers even refused to teach her, and many of the white students went home. But still, Ruby went to school every day, which is, again, so incredible to see. It really is. All right, so now we're going to talk about Malcolm X. Again, a civil rights leader who definitely erred more on the side of violence than nonviolence. And of course, is going to be very different from Martin Luther King Jr., yet respected by, these two men respected each other. Now, born in Omaha, Nebraska, Malcolm Little, again, his original name, was the son of a Baptist preacher who urged blacks to stand up for their rights. And his father was unfortunately killed by a white supremacist in Michigan in 1931. And later, Malcolm is going to move to Harlem, where he became really involved in gambling, drug dealing, robbery, and he was even arrested at the age of 20 for armed robbery. And the reason why this is important is because when he's in jail, he actually studied the teaching of Elijah Muhammad. Now, Elijah Muhammad is going to be a big influence in Malcolm X's life. Elijah Muhammad is going to be the leader of the mostly African-American political and religious group known as the Nation of Islam. His teachings are going to preach complete separation from whites in society. And he often expressed the idea that, blacks were the first people to rule the world, and that it was the whites that tricked them out of the power and oppressed them. And so, a young Malcolm X is going to develop his great speaking skills and political ideas under the direction of Elijah Muhammad. And they work hand in hand together, as, of course, eventually Malcolm X is going to join the Nation of Islam. So the Nation of Islam is an activist group that believed that most African Americans were originally Muslim, and the Nation of Islam is going to urge African Americans to reconvert to Islam in an effort to restore the heritage that was stolen from them. And so, in addition, the Nation of Islam wanted to create a second black nation here within the U.S. Now, you notice that his name was Malcolm Little, yet he's known as Malcolm X. And the reason why is because the X in Malcolm's name symbolizes the rejection of his slave name. And he urged his followers to do the same. Drop that slave last name and replace it with the X. So he becomes a huge activist, gains a huge name for himself, and makes constant accusations of racism and demanded violent actions of self-defense. Malcolm X really is an incredible activist that's very different from Martin Luther King Jr., yet both men have met and did respect one another, even if they didn't agree. Now, he constantly retold the injustices African Americans had suffered in the past, and he gathered very widespread admiration from both the African Americans and, well, widespread fear from whites, as again, he's going to be a lot more militant. Again, when he speaks, again in 1965, some of his quotes: "Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery." And nobody can give you freedom. Nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it. And you can't separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he has freedom. Again, very powerful words. So there tends to be some tension in the Nation of Islam. By the 1960s, the tension was definitely growing. Malcolm X was exposed to rumors that Elijah Muhammad had indulged in extramarital affairs, even that he had illegitimate children. And so adultery is very much shunned in the Muslim doctrine. So this was a very bad thing here. Malcolm believed that Elijah Muhammad was jealous of his increasing popularity, as of course, even today, you may have heard of Malcolm X prior to today's lesson, but you may not have heard of Elijah Muhammad because of that. Definitely, again, Malcolm X gained a lot of notoriety because of, well, his very great oration. He could speak very well. Now, the Nation of Islam is going to blame Malcolm X for his controversial remarks regarding JFK, again, dealing with the assassination, and they are going to go ahead and suspend him. But then again, he's going to, after being suspended, he's going to actually go ahead and leave of his own free will the Nation of Islam. And so he does actually make a trek to Mecca. He changes his name again, and then when he comes back, he is eventually going to be assassinated by rival black Muslims, again, while giving a speech, believe it or not, as well, right in the middle of the hall. It's very tragic. Speaking of tragedy, we have the case of Emmett Till. Now, this is the same person right here. This is what Emmett Till looked like on the left, before he took a trip down to Mississippi. And this is when he was found. So in 1955, we have one of the most heartbreaking tales. A 14-year-old African-American teenager named Emmett Till is going to be brutally murdered by white men while visiting relatives in Mississippi. It was said that he whistled at a female store clerk while buying a pack of gum. What happened was his body was sent back up to his mother, who lived in the Chicago area, and was told not to open the casket. Well, his mother not only opened the casket, but also had an open casket for his funeral, because she wanted to show the devastation of what racism is, what it's led to. This 14-year-old African-American boy that is just brutally murdered for no reason. Again, his murder and subsequent trial, we're going to talk about in a second, of his accused killers, become this lightning rod for moral outrage. Both at the time and to this day still. The case was not just about the murder of a teenage boy. It's more than that. It was about the new generation of young people committing their lives to social change, African American or other. And civil rights activists are going to use the murder of Emmett Till as a rallying cry for civil rights, for the protests, for transforming a very heinous crime into a springboard of justice. And the murderers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, are going to be acquitted for this crime. They're not going to be charged. In fact, they're going to light cigars up after the trial is over and they're found innocent. And that's because the jury was an all-white racist jury that were making racist remarks during the entire trial as well. Even one that said that the only reason why deliberation took so long is because they got some pop, like soda. Yeah, and this was all heard as there were African Americans that flooded the courtroom, that were onlookers during this trial. This is what they heard. It's horrible stuff. Another story we have is James Meredith, who attempted to become the first African American to gain admission to the University of Mississippi. So Meredith's admission to the University of Mississippi was opposed by state officials and students as well. But it's going to be President Kennedy who's going to decide to send 2 federal marshals, as you can see one of them there in the picture, to go ahead and protect him from threats of being lynched. And when word got out, riots broke out, and Kennedy sent even more troops to protect Meredith. And when the smoke clears, there's 160 marshals that are going to be wounded, 28 by gunfire, mind you, and 2 bystanders that are going to be killed. Despite this opposition, this insane opposition, Meredith continued to study at the university and successfully graduated in 1964. This was a huge step for the civil rights movement, as of course this shows that African Americans are going to continue with this mission of going ahead and gaining equality. Again, through all this adversity, they're still going to hold their head high. A very tragic story is Medgar Evers. He's going to be one of the first martyrs, unfortunately, of the civil rights movement. His death is going to prompt JFK to ask Congress for a comprehensive civil rights bill, which Lyndon Johnson's going to sign into law the following year. Now, that same night that Medgar Evers was, at NAACP functions and meetings and so on, he returns home just after midnight, and as he left his car with a handful of t-shirts that read, "Jim Crow must go," he was shot in the back, and his wife and children, who had been waiting up for him, found him bleeding to death on his doorstep. His wife recounted it to People magazine, saying, "I opened the door, and there was Medgar at the steps, face down in blood. And the children ran out and were shouting, 'Daddy, get up.'" Again, that's absolutely heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. Now, African Americans weren't the only ones facing a lot of prejudice in this country. And so the civil rights movement is going to continue, not just with African Americans, but with, again, other groups as well. Now, here we see the LGBTQ community and really their really springboard point of their civil rights movement. And so on the very early morning of June 28th, 1969, New York City police raided a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn and forced people out of the bar and onto the streets. And this is going to lead to protests and riots breaking out at the Stonewall Inn and actually right up and down that same street that it was on. And so Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar located on Greenwich Village on Manhattan's west side, is going to go ahead and springboard this, really help launch the gay rights movement. Unfortunately, it's still not a national landmark. It actually, I think it should be. I think many people do too. But nevertheless, it is really where we see this movement start. And again, we've seen this movement continue all the way through today, where again, we had a Supreme Court ruling that same-sex marriage is legal. During this time, we also have Native Americans that are going to go ahead and occupy Alcatraz, again, in the name of, their civil rights movement. An almost 19-month protest of 89 Native Americans and supporters are going to occupy Alcatraz Island, the Rock, which was abandoned federal lands. And so under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, any abandoned federal lands were to be returned to Native Americans who once occupied it. And so they did just that. So the Indians of all tribes, or IOAT, is going to occupy Alcatraz, setting up a small commune on the island until the government forcibly ended their occupation. And they did it pretty horribly. At first, they actually went ahead and cut off their electricity, and then eventually they're going to go ahead and forcibly take out the last remaining 15 people that hadn't left. Unfortunately, the occupation did die down in the later months. There was an accident that happened that definitely hurt the commune as a whole, and so it was in a little bit of a downfall. But nevertheless, it shows that, the U.S. government promised these Native Americans something, and of course, they didn't deliver. And so, legally, they thought, yes, this is our land based on the treaty you made with our people. So it is an incredible landmark for Native Americans as well. And some of the things, when you go to Alcatraz, you can still see, for example, very famously right there, one of the entrances to Alcatraz, you can see the Indians welcome, which is cool to see. You can still see it today. Next up, we have Cesar Chavez. He's incredible. He employs nonviolent means to bring about the attention to the plight of farm workers. The farm workers were getting horrible pay and horrible conditions. And so he's going to eventually form the United Farm Workers. As a labor leader, Chavez is going to lead marches, call for boycotts, and go on several hunger strikes. The most famous was actually, as you can see the grapes, was against the California grape growers due to the horrible conditions. He goes on literally on a hunger strike for quite a while, and eventually they do give in. The growers give in. They give better pay, better conditions to their workers. And Bobby Kennedy actually goes ahead and visits Cesar Chavez just as he's ending his hunger strike, which is pretty incredible to see. Now, although this is the end of our civil rights unit, it's not the end for civil rights. Civil rights continues right into today. And it's important to know that these are the origins of these civil rights for all of these groups, and that it is continuing right through today. Well, thank you for joining me today, and we'll catch you guys back in the classroom.